We're live.
Okay. Well, once again, hi. I want to, first of all, acknowledge that we are grateful to be doing these presentations, the CoRe Speaker Series, on the unceded traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam people. And also grateful to KPMG for supporting us by giving us this space in their building and providing us with refreshments. My name is Sharon Sutherland, and I am doing my own introduction today because we're missing one of our board members who will be sneaking in quietly soon. But I'll also start with a couple of notes about upcoming events. So we've got a few things coming, and a couple of them are really quite exciting and opportunities for people to get involved in different ways. June 4th is the last of our speaker series for this particular term. We start again in September, probably late September, but our dates haven't been announced for the fall yet. But June 4th, we're doing speed geeking. And for any of you who were at Speed Geeking last year, it is an amazing opportunity. We'll have 9 people presenting on a topic for 5 minutes each. They get 5 minutes to talk about something that they would completely geek out about that relates to conflict resolution in some way. 3 minutes of follow-up questions, but essentially it's, do you have an idea that is new and interesting, something that you've stumbled across in your own studies in conflict resolution? Perhaps it's something that you're doing that's completely unrelated, you think, but hey, there's ways of making connections. You can look at the examples from last year. They're still on our YouTube channel and have actually been great little resources for people. I've been encouraging people from the New Mediators group in particular to think about taking a chance and trying something there, because it's a great place to get some presentation opportunities. It gives you a recording of yourself doing a presentation, which frankly is something that you're often asked for if you're a new presenter applying to conferences and wanting to do that. And there is no friendlier audience. I'm looking around at several people who presented last year in this room, and I'm hoping that you'll agree and nod along with me that it was a super friendly group, that, yeah, it's a nice and easy way to get a chance to test something. So we've got a few people booked so far. I'm going to announce the 2 who are coming from out of town because it's kind of special attendance, and so they've absolutely already been accepted. Dan Williams will be coming down from Kamloops, and he'll be speaking about, I don't have his topic title, and I've been calling it something that he doesn't approve of. So I'm simply going to say the topic is it's online communication and the challenges that can occur in online communication. So he's going to talk about that a bit. Julie Dom is coming down from Fraser Lake and is going to be here that day. And so she is going to present on an unknown topic. I'm calling it undisclosed, but I think it may actually be undecided. But, but many of us have heard Julie in the past, so whatever she chooses I know is going to be exciting. We have 7 more spots in theory, although we've got quite a few proposals in. I think there's really 2 more spots. But I would encourage you to just send me some kind of description of what it is you'd like to do. Title, about up to 100 words description of the topic, and send me a really short bio. And I'll get back to you really quickly. We're going to be making some posts this week. June 4th, stick around after Speed Geeking, because it gets really fun. One of the reasons Dan Williams is coming down is because he is part of Pig and Potato Games, and he has been involved in creating a new collaborative game. Now, I say new, but this game was first created in 2014 at a game jam and has been just reinvigorated several different times. We finally have it at a playtesting level. And so we want people to stick around and try playing Soul Jumpers with us that night. You'll be the first people ever to play it outside of our own immediate group. And we need feedback, we need ideas, and it's still part of the development phase. So we really encourage you, if you have any interest in getting involved in collaborative game development, stick around on June 4th. Okay? It'll be fun. Soul Jumpers is a really interesting game. I can talk about it later. I will not talk about it now. And the last thing that we have happening this summer is, for many of you, you know that we've in the past done a summer reading club, where we've all chosen a book, done some reading, and then got together for a discussion. This year we're doing something a little bit different. This is why Julie Dahm is going to be in town, because one of the things she suggested was, hey, Canada Reads does a pretty fun thing where they're having these basically quite adversarial discussions around choosing a book. And wouldn't it be cool if we could actually choose some books that have conflict resolution focus and then have a really non-adversarial decision-making process around which book we're going to recommend. So we have 5 people who are each nominating a book, and the videos that they're making with their book choices should be going up this week. They will be pitching a book, and then they will be sitting down in a mediation run by Wendy Lacusta to actually come up with the book and have a consensus decision around what book we're all going to read. And whoever's book wins, I'm calling it wins because I'm just going into the adversarial mode automatically, but whichever book is chosen, that person will be doing a book club meeting in September, and we'll announce the date once we know who the person is. So they can match their schedule. And I will acknowledge that both Carrie and Darcy are advocating for books and are in the room here. And they're starting it now. I'm a little concerned that the fact that they're here means they get a little advantage because you start having conversations afterwards. Don't let them sway you too much. Anyway, should be a really great process. So those are the things that are coming up. I'm going to flip through this. I said to some of the folks in the room, I had a little bit of an interesting challenge in terms of what I was doing. And the challenge led to me putting this PowerPoint together really at the last second today. So if you are online and you can't read because I have grossly overdone text on a few of the slides in cutting and pasting things, I was treating it a little bit more as a resource than as a presentation tool. You can download that from the CoRe website. It is up there right beside the live stream link. So just download your own copy. And it is created more as a resource than anything else. The other thing that was happening for me was that when I was originally approached to do this topic, it was in the context of my having previously presented on adapting processes and client voice in CLE. And I had done, between 2 different presentations, 16 hours of material on the topic, which of course left me thinking, oh, that's easy. No problem, I have tons to talk about. So it's as you get closer and closer to date, you're going, I still haven't managed to figure out what to leave out of the 16 hours. So what I ultimately ended up doing is I've identified a few different topics to talk about and put in a lot of resources. And if there are topics that we're talking about that are of particular interest to the group, please let me know. And that includes the online audience. For the online audience, Darcy is monitoring both email at coreclinic1@gmail.com and is also looking at the chat in the YouTube, on the YouTube itself. So either of those 2 will work and you can pass on a message. I will just warn you, for those of you who don't normally attend online, you have a slight delay, so we're not ignoring you. We usually are just a couple minutes ahead of whatever, so we'll get to the question as soon as it's an opportunity to do that. Okay. So just talking about the outline today, I thought I would very quickly talk about self-determination and the reasons why we care about self-determination. And I say quickly because I think within this group in particular, that's something that we probably start with some pretty common understanding that we want that to be the case, rather than needing convincing that self-determination is something that should take place. But I do want to talk about it at least a little bit. Also talk about factors that impact full participation. Now, there are so many of these that we won't talk about all of them by any means today, but I've tried to select a few that are less discussed because they might be illustrative of some of the things that we aren't always thinking about, and they might also trigger some ideas around adaptations. So that's the objective with making that choice. I want to talk about the process assumptions that we make in the kinds of processes we choose, things that might impact capacity to participate in ways that we don't necessarily think through. So again, relatively short conversation on that, hopefully. And then talk about process options. Now, there's some interweaving of process options into the rest of it, but that's kind of the basic plan. And if we have some time, definitely talk about some scenarios. And I don't want to shut people down because I'm plowing through a ton of material. So if there are questions, definitely do raise a hand. We can, because I don't mind diverting into a topic that is of particular interest and spending more time on it. That said, just a reminder, I think most people here have been reminded enough times, you can't speak from behind Darcy. If you want to ask a question, you have to at least stand beside Darcy. You don't necessarily have to get on screen, but you do have to stand beside her in order to be heard effectively. And it doesn't matter that you think you're loud. It is a directional mic. You can be as loud as you want. It still won't pick you up. All right. Before I get started, any questions or anybody like deeply concerned that this is not the topic they think they're here for? Not so far. Good. Okay. So as I said, I wanted to talk quickly about this notion of creating client voice, of what self-determination means and why we do it. And I'm going to acknowledge somebody in the room. Those of you who know CoRe well know that this is a topic that she has spoken about quite a number of times, about just how we have ethical requirements related to self-determination. And it's a topic that she's had some great presentations with the CoRe Clinic on. But I'm going to just talk about the one little piece of it. We really have kind of three reasons why we might want to or might care about self-determination. And I've kind of broke it into, there's some ethical requirements. We're actually obligated to consider self-determination. The quote I've got up there is just pulling from the Mediate BC Standards of Conduct. And there's an entire section on self-determination, as most of you will know. As mediators, we're looking at the act of coming to a voluntary, non-coerced decision in which a party makes free and informed choices, particularly with respect to the outcomes. Lots of caveat language in that. But that said, there's this, it's something that is upfront in the standards of conduct for mediators. It shows up in standards for parenting coordinators. It shows up in all kinds of different places. Depending on where you're practicing, what kind of work you do, you probably have something that refers to it. To a large extent, it's embedded in a lot of different professional codes. We also have these competency factors that play in that I think align really closely with this notion of your ethical requirement to ensure self-determination. And what I put up is this ethical requirement to be competent in properly identifying and managing cases involving vulnerable people. And I think that's a really significant part that interplays with self-determination. Because vulnerable parties, and we'll talk a little bit about who those are, but vulnerable parties is a really, really broad topic. But it often is talking about people who, for one reason or another, may not be able to engage as readily, as easily, or without adaptations in a process that we treat as, oh, there's a standard one-size-fits-all. And I say that I know most people make some kinds of adaptations and are really conscious of certain things. I don't think any of us are as conscious as we should be of all of the different possibilities. And that's really what I want to talk about today. So I'm really not saying, oh, you've never thought of making sure there was a ramp for the wheelchair. I'm saying there's probably other things that each of us doesn't have the awareness to recognize that might be creating a challenge to true self-determination. Okay? Philosophically, we approach self-determination if we believe that everybody should be able to participate and that autonomy is an important value and something that should be supported. That isn't necessarily everybody's starting point. So I'm mentioning it because while I'm kind of making this assumption throughout that it's what we want to accomplish and the reasons for these adaptations is to allow for those things, I do recognize that in many cases there's a different view. There's a view that, oh, there are people who can't, and it isn't. They will make bad choices for themselves that are not in their own interests. And as we go through and we talk about some of the different kinds of vulnerabilities, it'll be very obvious that I feel really strongly on the philosophical side that everybody should be supported to make the decisions that they can, to the extent that they possibly can, and that most people can make some level of informed choice. And and that we're taking away autonomy every time we make that choice for them. Or even when we sometimes turn into an evaluative process and tell them what we think is right within a set of values and rules that we are choosing. We may be lawyers and say, the law is fair. That's a good standard. Yes.
That's a whole other evening.
It's a whole other evening. That's why I'm kind of throwing it out there. Like that, as an example, we might make a call like that, or we might think something else is the way we measure fairness, or that is a good model. But I think self-determination also involves being able to set your own value standards around how you're making those measures. And people can really be in disagreement. So it's really about a philosophical approach to empowering clients. And this is, as I say, I don't need to talk about this with this group particularly, but I've got it here because I had a slide for a completely different group. So I have added here the fact that it's actually just really practical, which is something that often helps with convincing folks that, hey, it really makes a difference. You get better agreements with more input, and outcomes demonstrably better, demonstrably meets people's needs more when you're creating those. They're more durable, less likely to fall apart. So clearly things that are just practical. If you're really just coming from that place of, hey, I want to make my client happy by winning here, you get better client satisfaction if the parties participate. When I mentioned the perceptions of procedural justice, there have been so many studies over the years around the importance of client voice and participation and self-determination. And over and over and over again, studies that look at different processes and the ways parties participate in processes have demonstrated that people will rank having voice as more important to their perception of procedural fairness than the outcome. They may not get anything they want, but if they feel like they were heard, they will actually still be more satisfied with the process than if they weren't heard but got everything. So it's an interesting thing. It's important to be listened to. So these are all kind of reasons. And as I say, I don't think they're the super big part of this talk for you, everybody here. This is fascinating. Just a second. Do I have a second one?
Oh, that's so interesting.
Okay. Just checking. This is what happens when you put your PowerPoints together just before you leave. You never run them. Anyway, I think it's an interesting question to talk about who's vulnerable. And it's difficult in this space to kind of get everybody to just brainstorm around it. But what I put up is some indications that would be the visible indicators. Because as I said, this isn't not where I want to focus today, but you will have visible indicators that somebody may be experiencing some kind of challenge in participating. It may be that you realize you have to make accommodations for somebody to access a site. You may have to ensure that an elderly person is able to move around, has a chair that is going to be sufficiently comfortable, is not injuring themselves in any particular way, maybe is closer to a washroom and able to get there. So there's things that might be indicators to make you think about the logistics around what you're doing. Children, I realize that not everybody recognizes when you see that semicolon that it is potentially a visible symbol of another type of challenge, of a mental health challenge. The semicolon tattoo really took off 2015, I think. I'm looking to the people in the front row that I think know the answer to this. but it was around 2015 that people started getting the semicolon tattoo to indicate having struggles with suicidal ideation. And the semicolon is a symbol of continuing, not a final end. It's not a period. It's life continuing. But it's an expression of a mental health challenge that might actually be a physical thing that will show up. So you have some physical indicators, but I was going to ask just more broadly about other kinds of things beyond the physical. Obviously the mental health was tucked in there too. And I'm going to flip a slide to kind of some broader topics of things that might be impacting the potential to participate meaningfully. But there's more. I just want to say, this is by no means, this is not it, okay? But these are relatively common things that will come up for us in any kind of consensual decision-making process. So you've got the various physical limitations, and I'm going to talk briefly as we go on about a couple of them. I've made choices. And I don't know. I tried to come up with a great rationale for each of my choices, but honestly, part of it is just, I think these ones are under discussed. So I've tended to focus on those. So I'm going to talk about brain injuries briefly. I'm also going to talk a little bit about trauma, and I'm going to talk about age. So children and people with dementia, so getting to usually a different age, not always, and some culture. So those are the ones, and I'm otherwise going to send you off to a bunch of resources on other kinds of topics. And if you're flipping ahead in the slides, you'll see, like, I just really hit the resources big, because I think there's a lot of these things that are much easier to pick up. So I don't know, is there anything on there that's leaping out as, hey, that's a topic, really wish we were talking about that a bit more? Or anything that you're really disturbed that I don't have on the list? Yeah.
Should I come up there?
Yes, please. If you just stand by the
right
words.
here, you're good.
Okay. Just maybe it can relate to cultural norms, but I'm thinking internet and online communities.
Yep, absolutely. And I will say we're going to talk a little bit about online as one of the process choices that can be made that I think is not considered frequently enough around ways to deal with some of the other issues that come up. But it's a great place to talk a little bit about the norms in online communities. And I invite you to talk about that at that point. I think it will fit a little under cultural norms, but we can explicitly bring that out when we get to that point. I'm, of course, usefully making a note where I'm then going to turn it over there. I just caught myself doing it. Okay, so quite a few of you have probably had the opportunity, I'm going to just canvass the group here, have had the opportunity now to start some kind of conversation on trauma-informed practice. Anybody? Okay, there's way less hands going up than I thought there would be. Oh, it's because people didn't want to put their hands up, not because they had. I want to talk about it a little bit, mostly because there's a couple really amazing courses coming up if you're not, if you haven't gone to something on trauma-informed practice. And it's really, so it's timely to talk about, but it's also one of those under-discussed topics again. It's one where one of the challenges is that a lot of people, when you say PTSD, for instance, how many people think immediately, military veterans? Yeah. Do many of you go to, I think the other one that is the most common thought is sexual assault survivors.
Yeah.
Okay. Thing is, a traumatic event, the way it's defined in terms of things that can cause PTSD, is so much broader than that. And we're really neglecting huge areas of people who might be impacted because we create this belief that it is around a couple things that we see in popular culture or we hear about in one way or another. You can have PTSD, you can develop trauma simply by being involved. Here's an event is considered traumatic and potentially something that could cause PTSD if a person experiences or witnessed or is confronted with an event or events involving actual or threatened death or serious injury or a threat to the physical integrity, not just of themselves but of others. It's got to have some kind of really intense fear reaction to it, but there's so many different levels in which things can happen that do that, that cause that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the prevalence of trauma, and it looks like this is going to just give you a zillion stats one at a time. But I kind of want to emphasize it because I think we do get confused about trauma and we think it's a limited thing, but it really impacts a huge number of people. So we're at 76% of people have experienced one event at least traumatic enough to cause PTSD. Doesn't mean it happens. Not everybody experiences PTSD as a result of one of these issues. One of the other studies I was looking at, a US study, talks about how 90% of people in the US have experienced something that could cause PTSD. And in that study, the numbers they come up with are about 9% actually do develop it. So numbers are huge. The interesting part about the study is they spent a lot of time in the American study trying to figure out why the US has dramatically higher levels of traumatic events than any other country in the world. And I just thought you have to be American to ask that question.
Yes.
However,
America first.
Yeah, it's a big win. Yeah, highest levels of traumatic events, but the 9% is probably a useful number, just the way that the study was done, to apply to ours too. So you're still looking at a smaller number of traumatic events, but you're looking at a really large number of people who have been exposed to things that could cause it. Trauma can start at any time too. It doesn't always happen right after. Traumatic PTSD can come on months later. It is not something that is immediately apparent. And often that's one of the things that really causes challenges for people in understanding what's happening for them, because they were fine and now they're not. The most common forms of trauma to cause it: unexpected death of a loved one, sexual assault, seeing somebody badly injured or killed. So you've got your sexual assault survivors in there. You've obviously got why it comes up in the military so often in there. The one that doesn't show up on the lists as most common, and it's not most common, but it's increasingly something that we're hearing about, and it might be news to some of you, but they're increasingly diagnosing PTSD in people who have gone through litigation, in particular as self-represented litigants, but not exclusively. And it is to such a high degree that one of the people I spoke with last year in talking about this had actually developed a counseling practice where she was doing entirely work with PTSD survivors of family litigation. So that, I mean, so in our world, we need to be conscious of that as a source of PTSD. And PTSD is something that's going to cause all kinds of different things that impact our ability to participate. So there we've got the 9% of people. Women are 2 times more likely to develop PTSD than men, which surprises a lot of people because a lot of people do have that military idea in their head and so aren't thinking of women. But they're 2 times more likely. Whether that has to do with the types of events they experience or what, I've never seen anybody really explain that number. I've just seen the number repeatedly.
Where's that number come from?
That particular one I didn't write the study down, but there's at least 3 studies that I was looking at that all use that number. Yeah. So at least 50% of Canadian women and that's 1/3, by the way. There you go. There's my first typo that needed to be corrected. 1/3 of Canadian men have survived at least one incident of sexual or physical violence. So we're talking very large numbers of people who are possibly engaged. So this is the estimate, and I did put the one study down, Suzanne. I think that might be one of the studies that has the 2 times as well. But it's, so estimating numbers of Canadians currently with PTSD. Those are astonishing numbers.
And that's 10 years ago.
That's 10 years ago. It's not going to be smaller. Yeah. So as I say, I've tried to choose to talk about those topics that we don't think about as being prevalent all the time. But when you think about the kinds of things that are causing this, there's a whole series of different types of issues that we might get in our practice that actually have a really reasonable likelihood that somebody is experiencing trauma. It's not just if you're doing child protection work or if you're working with domestic abuse in your practice or things like that. Think about personal injury cases. The number of times somebody they're fine actually, physically fine, but they watched their child killed. They saw somebody else die. It's horrible. It's just hard to imagine. You also get the medical malpractice kinds of things, right? Anytime you're dealing there. Veterinary malpractice. I don't want to understate how traumatic it can be when you lose a pet. And that's actually some of the places where I've seen more trauma than in almost anything else, actually, just in my own practice. Estates, you've always got, a death has always occurred. If it's post, if you're not doing a prevention or a discussion around creating a will, you're dealing with a situation where there's death. You might have product liability situations that give rise to these kinds of things. They're often around an injury that's been caused in some way or another. I mean, these are just me brainstorming some of the kinds of things. Civil suits that are around sexual harassment, that are around, and it doesn't have to be sexual harassment. There can be all kinds of bullying and abuse within workplaces that actually can lead to trauma and PTSD. So you've got all of these kinds of things. But I think we have a tendency to assume when we walk into the room that if we're not in very specific types of circumstances, that that's not something we need to prepare for. And I don't think it's always something that's going to come out and be obvious in your conversations with people, because much of what happens with somebody experiencing trauma isn't as obvious. So when we talk about adaptations, some of the things that I want to talk about are things that I think are really good adaptations regardless, because you don't know who's in the room. And one of the examples that I've been using around trauma is actually talking about my partner, who, when hearing us talk about trauma, when I was having a conversation in the house around this, he was kind of going, oh, he had one of these moments of recognition that he had just recently, as a corporate tax lawyer, been in a negotiation where somebody was really, really seriously impacted by trauma, and he had never once thought that was the thing going on, and had never once turned his mind to, we should be changing the process. There are things we need to do to adapt. And of course he hadn't, because we don't think that way. We forget that there's a zillion different ways that people can be impacted, and it isn't always in the way that they come into the room. They might be there to talk about there's lots of other things. So some of the things that just as on a quick note, trauma really hampers a person's ability to make choices. Right? It really does. So if we're talking about creating a space for self-determination, we have to create a space in which somebody who struggles to make a decision, struggles to participate in different kinds of ways, can actually have space to do that. And it should be I think it should be part of all of our processes at all times, regardless of what it is or what we know, because we can't be diagnosing that. That isn't our role, but we may have that. It tends to damage voice. It tends to make people much quieter, much less willing to talk. It interferes with the ability to cope with stress, for instance. Like, that's a really big part of it. And most of the things we do are high stress. It can change your attention span. It can change emotional reactions and cause you to overreact, frequently overreact to something that seems like a minor issue. And it really reduces reasoning capacity in different ways. I think did anybody here not go through training where they said, here's the anger cycle? Like, we've all seen that, and we talk about it because we know we recognize anger.
Right.
But all of those chemicals that are flowing through the system in anger that we're talking about, they're all part of that fear response too. And this is a fear response. So those different charts that we look at where reasoning is declining as our anxiety is rising, they're applicable to people with trauma too. And you need to be able to create space where it's not going to trigger that. It can also just lead to intense distress and fear and feelings of helplessness. And if you think about the ways that people respond from helplessness, you'll picture it. Okay, whatever you say. I'm giving up. I want to get out of the room. I want to do anything. I'm going to agree to anything. Yeah, not a profound sense of self-determination when people are trying to just get out of the space. Mm-hmm. And giving things up and throwing it away to avoid trauma, that's really, really difficult. So I'm kind of flagging it as one of those areas that, as I say, I think it's under-discussed. If you're getting close to 1 million people experiencing PTSD at any given time, and there's other people who are in new grief and experiencing similar emotions, we've got a lot of people experiencing these kind of things. I'm going to talk just a little bit about children. And I will say, actually, before I leave trauma, part of the resource stuff, I am pointing to you to, in the resources, 2 different courses that are being run at the JI. The one I've listed first is when Kat Bellamano is doing something, because I think she's amazing on the topic because she comes from such a really strong mediator background that the work she does on trauma is fantastic. But it's 2 days in Victoria, the one that's currently listed. Hopefully we will see her doing it in New West as well. But it's something to definitely look at. And you'll also see a series of different documents that you can go to and link to that are trauma-informed practice resources to get yourself more informed. Yeah.
We have a question from our internet audience.
Yes?
Can we chat more about process decisions to support someone who would give anything up to be done?
We can.
It's from Amanda.
It's from Amanda?
Amanda,
Yeah.
yes.
Amanda, we can chat about it. I will make a note. If I forget for whatever reason, when we get to the process choice stuff, I was going to try and do a kind of broad discussion of a bunch of process choices that will apply more broadly to all of these things that I'm kind of mentioning. But I will make a note that, like, emphasize the ones and anything that's an add-on to that for sure. And if anybody else has thoughts when we get to that point, I welcome other ideas too, because I'm not pretending like all my ideas are like that's it. I'm just trying to shape this discussion a bit. Mm-hmm. All right. So children, as I say, this is going to be relatively quick because there's been a lot of work done on how do you bring children's voice into different processes, how do you engage people. One of those things is Arlene Henry did a great presentation for CoRe, which is still online on our YouTube channel, and I gave you the link on the resources. She talked about bringing children into specifically family dispute resolution, but all of the things that she's talking about there are applicable across the board. But I thought that we could do a really quick frame of something that I think people forget is that Canada is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which actually tells us that we need to assure the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters. There's actually some obligations that I think we just tend to forget about. So, yeah, I'm getting these nods. From the youngest people in the room who've been shut down the most. But on that note, all I really want to do is I was going to emphasize a few things that are supports for children. I fit them in here because we're talking about children and because, as I say, I'm kind of skipping over this aside from saying, let's make sure we're aware of it. But some of these will come up again, okay? For everybody who is experiencing any kind of stress or anxiety, ADHD, experiencing anything that is causing them different levels of challenges in staying focused. That can be brain injury, that can be PTSD, that can be children who don't have attention, that can be dementia, that can be a ton of different types of illnesses that mimic it. It can be addictions. Such a broad range of things will create challenges with focus. And the things that we name as supports for children are often really good things to think about having in the room for anybody. The fidgets, some people get driven crazy by having fidgets in the room, but there's actually like interesting studies done on the different types of fidgets that you might use for different types of ADHD in particular. There's a lot of educational literature on providing kids who are struggling to focus in classrooms with calming fidgets. There's some that are specifically calming. Some are specifically around actually being stimulating, because stimulating color and light can actually cause people to be able to focus, because they actually need to have that to draw attention. Chewables. We don't think of bringing chewables. We think about bringing food. We don't think about bringing something you can actually gnaw on. But there are a lot of different things that actually impacts. The kneadable. We often think about the squishies. Squishies seem to be in cushies. All of those are the things we do think about. But varied textures are actually really important. So, I mean, just give some thought to it. Drawing and visuals, again, this is going to be way broader than just children. This is absolutely going to plug into different culture. It'll plug into language issues. It'll plug into anybody who tends to need to look at something, and sometimes that's somebody who actually has a fear happening around sitting and looking and making eye contact in the room. Things that can create distractions and move things away. So you'll see in the resources, I've given you links to Lisa Aurora's online webinars to have a look at her talking about her own visual facilitation practice. And she talks in great more detail about that. That's one way to go, but there's a ton of other ways you can think about visuals, and it can be just around creating something in the room that is going to create some distraction. I've thrown up bots because that's one of my favorite things to use, just because it's like a fidget, but it's also like just super cute. And so listening bots are really fun. Again, I gave you the link to Gary Hirsch's website so that you can have a look at them. And I've thrown in image theater as just kind of this other thing that is an actual physical way of changing things that works really well with kids. Shape your body into the way you feel, right? That's often, we're talking drawing visuals, we can ask somebody to draw their feelings, but some people really struggle with that. Some kids in particular, I've found really way more responsive to, just show us. Shape yourself into it. And it can be really powerful to have everybody do it. Everybody in the room shape themselves into how they're feeling. So there's a lot of different kinds of things like that. Yeah. So just a couple really quick thoughts on children. And it's really just a flag. Hey, kids, they don't have to be there the whole time. Having meaningful voice, and this is true of everybody who might be struggling in any way, voice doesn't mean you're in the room for every part of every discussion, and that everything is focused around making sure you're talking at all times or engaged in all ways. It needs to be safe. Different people are going to have different levels of safety and different abilities to participate. So partial attendance. Come in and make a statement. Come in at the end, hear what resolutions have been reached. Participate through a representative perhaps, so that you've got some, but hopefully a representative who actually is able to make you feel like you've been heard, which isn't always true if you have a lawyer assigned who comes in and does a quick interview and doesn't actually have any particular training in working with children, and that does happen. and will come in and just say, the child's best interests, in my personal view, are these. And I've seen that happen a number of times, which is why I kind of flag it as that's not meaningful voice. It's not going to feel like meaningful voice. But somebody who can, Arlene's talk will talk quite a bit about Hear the Child reports and the way those work. But you can also do things like having children write letters, having children draw pictures, taking just pure photos of the child. They can do all kinds of things. So, and just be conscious that we think about most of these in the sphere of children. We don't always think about them in the sphere of others. And I want to emphasize, okay, these are things we think of because we're thinking a small child can't do this. They may apply completely in the same way to an adult who's experienced a brain injury and is having similar kinds of focus issues, and actually does need somebody to help them find ways to participate. Leading me into dementia, which I've kind of thrown in here partly because, again, we don't talk about it in the kinds of numbers. So I found several different studies, and the numbers seem to range between 340,000 and 500,000 Canadians living with dementia, which is lots. That's a lot of people, and approximately 45% of people, 45 and older, living in long-term residential care. So,
That seems enormous.
yes, it does, but there's not that many people living in long-term residential care.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I read it.
Yeah.
Yeah. 45% of those 45 and older live in residential
No,
care.
no,
That's
no.
how- That's what I thought. That's outrageous.
I also heard
No?
that.
I am apparently badly punctuated because several people in the room had the same reaction. I knew what I meant, and therefore that's the only way it could be taken. Anyway, for those who haven't spent time with somebody with dementia, it's really a broad term. Like you're talking about symptoms associated with cognitive decline. So things that will be at different stages at different times. And so people will be starting to experience and demonstrate some types of memory loss. There's some patterns often to the ways people experience it, but it can be really, really rapid. It can be super long. I have a relative who was diagnosed with dementia 20 years before her death, and went through, so 20 years of always being at a completely different stage in terms of what one can actually grapple with and what you can do and what kinds of decisions can be made. I found that was actually that and living with someone with dementia is a really powerful way of giving you insight into the ways that people can make decisions and the degree to which people don't let them make decisions. It is.
So am I being too expressive?
We've got somebody else who's had the experience. But it's astonishing how many people, even in healthcare industry, they start from the perspective of, we take away all autonomy. And the second there's a diagnosis, it's you can't make decisions. The person that I think does the most compelling discussion of this, and I couldn't find anything online that I could send you to where he's really written about it deeply, but I'm just, I'm saying one more time to CD that he's somebody I wish we could get into the CLE for one of the workshops that we're doing in the fall. Yeah, anyway, that's my pitch for getting Don here. Don DeSaulnier is, he was a lawyer and mediator in Seattle and was doing quite a lot of different types of things in Seattle. He did speak at CoRe, but before we were doing live streams, so we don't have a recording. And that was before he did a degree. He took a certificate course in gerontology. So what he's now doing is much deeper than what he was doing before. But he started because he had a wife who had really early onset dementia. And it was really impactful. He was finding it, that all the things he'd learned, he didn't know how to apply. And so even at that early stage, he was finally starting to turn his mind to the ways in which he could be using reframing tools. He could be using active listening tools to assist somebody at various stages to actually more effectively express their voice. And particularly as a family member, and he now he has actually created a career in supporting people with dementia in decision-making processes. So really, really interesting, and I hope that we get a chance to hear from him at some point. But he's really emphasized things like his point is, you know what, the big question is, how much do we value autonomy? Because how quickly do we seize all autonomy? We just say, no, you can't make a decision about your finances, so you don't get to decide about anything else, like what you have for lunch. And that is really the way it tends to happen in our societies. We tend to take away everything. And so some of the things that he's talked about is trying to find ways that you can support somebody to think about, okay, what are the types of decisions that you can really safely make? And also, I mean, he asks questions like, you know, what is poor judgment, right? Because that's usually what we say is it's poor judgment. That's just like you're exhibiting really poor judgment. Well, yeah. What is the impact of that particular decision? And is it something you should be able to do anyway, if it works? It's quite a big scale around that decision making, and really, I really appreciate hearing from him on the emphasis to really, really look there. What are the small decisions you can make, and how big can they be? And are there ways to support you? So a lot of those still cross over into some of the same kinds of things, length of timing that you can be there, what time of day are events. Dementia is one of those wonderful things. That's where we got the term sundowning. It applies to lots of people with illnesses and brain injuries as well, but we tend to use it mostly with dementia. Maybe not after a full day. Maybe have decisions made at certain times and schedule things differently. There's also a lot of different diseases that mimic the dementia symptoms, and often the kinds of things we can do around that, around dementia, are really effective for those too if we're not really sure what's presenting. We don't know. It might be profound depression. It could be effects of medicines. Lots of them create those kind of impressions, including brain injuries. Now, I'm specifically not spending a lot of time on brain injuries because one of our accepted topics, which I didn't acknowledge earlier, for our speed geeking in June, is a wonderful talk from our resident expert on concussion, who's going to talk about negotiating while concussed. But I thought that I would at least hit the prevalence things, because this is something. 160,000 Canadians suffer brain injury each year. But over 1 million Canadians live with the effects of a brain injury at any given time. That number astounded me, despite the fact that we've had lots of concussions that are quite profound in our family. Somehow, I still thought we were just uniquely unlucky. But having started talking about some of the concussions, it's surprising to me how many people come up and go, yeah, I had this period of 2 years where I couldn't function. I had to take this, 18 months off work. For me, I had 3 months when I couldn't read. And do you want to know how difficult that is when you're teaching law? I could not look at a screen, I could not teach, and I had such poor judgment that I continued to do both. So, really brilliant. But those are the kinds of things that do come up all the time. And I find that this is one of those wonderful things where concussion as a particular form of this is so incredibly invisible. It has such interesting impacts, and I'm going to let Darcy talk about it in June, so I really encourage you to come to that. But some of those are, like, I'll tell you my story. I engaged in a really, really important negotiation 1 week after I had experienced the really severe injury. One day after Darcy had forced me to go to the hospital because I was slurring but not acknowledging that there was anything wrong. Here's how little anybody noticed. The hospital The doctors refused to think I was slurring. They kept telling me how I had awesome balance for somebody my age. I'm just like going, okay, but like that's flattering, I suppose, but then I have like way more awesome balance normally. But yeah, my partner actually had to keep telling the doctors, no, that's not how she talks normally. No, she can walk a line without wobbling crazily like that. But I left there with the doctors saying I was in pretty darn good shape. Went to this negotiation, and it's ridiculous. Like, it was months afterwards that I realized that I had completely torpedoed absolutely everything I had actually cared about in relation to that negotiation by being unable to carry on an effective conversation. I tracked only what was last said. I couldn't keep my mind on the bigger picture and what I wanted to accomplish. I just responded. Whoever spoke last, I responded to that point. And wow, you're not very persuasive when you do that. But it was months later when I was going, that was kind of me self-sabotaging, wasn't it? As I was getting annoyed about the bad decisions everybody had made and not been convinced by me. But it's only in retrospect that I was able to recognize how poorly I did. And that's what people who knew me well, and I had been driven in, accompanied to the room for the negotiation because I couldn't stand properly, and still nobody thought that I was having a problem. And we still proceeded. So I don't know, my own experience tells me we don't give enough attention to this particular problem. Yeah, one of those things we don't acknowledge. Cultural barriers. There's so many different ways we can talk about cultural barriers, and again, this is a full topic. There is no way this is not a full topic, and I would rather not spend a lot of time, but I don't want to ignore the fact that it exists as a topic, because I think we do ignore this topic. I think that while we'll say, oh, we make some assumptions around our processes, that they will work this way, ooh, we think direct communication is everybody's norm rather than indirect. We might have those kind of conversations. We rarely talk about the degree to which we actually make tons of assumptions about what kind of processes will be comfortable, how people will participate, and whether they're participating, which I think is actually the worst bit. Because we may have had all these wonderful questions in pre-mediation discussions about what do you need to feel comfortable? Who are the right support people? How do we do this? And yet, in the moment, as we're actually conducting a process, we are looking at the person and saying, oh, they don't have anything to say. As opposed to, they're waiting for an entirely different invitation to speak than what I am giving them. Or they will not speak in this environment with these people in the room because of who seems to have authority, or there are so many different ways that it plays out, and a lot of those different things are things that, sure, it's about trying to be aware, but I think we just need to be always even more aware. The pictures I threw up there was just, I was traveling last week. We went down to pick up Rowan in LA. And while I was in the area where, those of you who saw the news story about, you probably saw it as Bob Marley's granddaughter, Airbnb-ing while black. I don't know if you saw that one. I was staying in an Airbnb, like literally the next town over from her. They had 6 police cars, I believe, and a helicopter arrived because a neighbor had phoned the police because 3 black women were leaving the house with suitcases. Now, I mean, obviously I'm not suggesting we're doing that in our mediations, but the part that we do sometimes, I think, unconsciously, is the part that the house owner did. Because the house owner then got on TV and said, oh, it was just, if they had just like waved and smiled, it would have all been fine. Right. Well, maybe it would have been, but probably not unless they were white. And why? Why are there these assumptions that these are the kinds of behaviors? The story that came out like at the same time was the 2 Indigenous youth who were touring Colorado State University, and the police were called and they were dragged out of the visit tour because somebody on the tour, the parent, had called the police and said, they don't seem normal, and they're not being very friendly, and they're not talkative. And they had arrived late and joined the group and hadn't been part of the initial introduction thing, but they did join, and they were following, and they were being polite. But they were dragged out of the group by the police to talk about whether they belonged there on this college tour. These are really extreme things, and we like to think, okay, sure, we probably would catch ourselves before the extreme, but they're good reminders that many, many times people make assumptions about what things should look like. You should have waved. You should have talked. You should have smiled. Most of the women in the room will have experienced at least 17,000 smiles.
Yep.
Yeah, we all get it in different places, and when it's about us, those kinds of things we recognize, we don't always recognize the things. They don't always blow up this way, but we might be making those kind of assumptions. Somebody's not talking because they're shy, rather than they're waiting for that opportunity. Somebody's not doing this. All kinds of ways that we actually inadvertently create barriers to full participation because we haven't figured out what's needed. So that's all I wanted to talk about. And I put it in, honestly, partly because it was just weird traveling in the US and literally being at an Airbnb, probably the next Airbnb over at the time these were going, and it was really emphasizing how challenging it can be to be conscious of our cultural assumptions. So I'm going to move into the question I said I'd get to, the assumptions that are built into the process itself. And I just took a really short list of, and I meant it to be broad around all kinds of just different types of collaborative processes, collaborative decision making, because I will then talk about there being different processes. But I think there's quite a few things that are built in that we don't question. We don't always question the possibility of in-person. We like to assume everything should be in person, that that's a right way to do it, that's a better way to do it. In person is best. We have a lot of assumptions around timing and duration of events. I'm going to say, I bet nobody in this room is actually one of those mediators who says, I will just keep them there, and I won't let them go to the bathroom, and I won't feed them. And if we just sit here long enough, somebody will cave, and then we'll have a settlement. But I'm seeing enough nods and smiles of recognition that you've met those people. They exist. That's the extreme end of it. But most of us figure that, you know what, everybody can last 2 hours. Nobody needs a break faster than that, right? We'll schedule it. That's us scheduling short time. Well, not true. What time of day are we doing? It's so much more convenient to start in the morning, so we'll just start in the morning. Yeah, well, not if you're dealing with an addiction sometimes, right? Like, there's a lot of things that might indicate different kinds of timing. Locations, beyond the is it accessible, does it create that? Locations have resonances that can be really, really powerfully problematic. I know that when I started doing child protection mediation, the norm was to always schedule meetings in the ministry offices. So meeting somebody who has intergenerational trauma as a result of 3 generations of people being seized and adopted out and families broken up by ministry, and then I greet them coming into the office so I look like I'm part of the staff, you'll never recover from that in terms of truly looking like you're a separate part of the process. Similarly, you end up with all kinds of locations that are problematic. I always am astonished that one of the circuit courts in BC takes place in a residential school, in an old residential school, right? Like, it just, the sense, and it's a choice, and the community supports it, but it would be, you'd have to have a large question mark about, is this how we want to do it? Is that a place those kinds of events should take place? Locations have lots of different importance. We tend to think a little bit about, well, you can speak for yourself, or having a lawyer gives you a voice. But if you don't connect with your lawyer on any way, if you're afraid of your lawyer, if you come from a culture in which lawyers are actually highly suspect, and there are lots of cultures in which lawyers are seen as part of the problem, that's not necessarily going to be the person who should speak for you. I'll share one partial story just about attending as a support person at a mediation, at a personal injury mediation with somebody from a different culture who had language issues, and had a lawyer. And she was under attack throughout the whole process in what I considered grossly and overtly racist ways. Assumptions were made around decisions that she had made, and there were arguments being made that she would not have actually made that decision. Nobody would. It's not normal. Well, it was very culturally normal for her. It might not have been culturally normal for the adjuster, but that's a totally different question. And her lawyer never once in the entire process registered that that was a problem and that she was being shut down. And that she was being told by everybody in the room that this is the decision you should have made about your children. And you made a weird choice that shows you must be lying about everything else. And everything, all her credibility was turning on that decision. It was actually really appalling. But it really, really drove home for me how little one can assume that a lawyer who is absolutely advocating for her, there's no question, really strongly advocating, can actually help with voice all the time. Because they don't always get it. And that's a real challenge, but I think we make assumptions that if we add a lawyer, we've got a safety net. They can speak for somebody, they can help. They can't always translate those things though. And that was a really difficult one. Anyway, I won't go into any more detail about that, but it was just it was a really, really difficult process, and a lot of it for me was the fact that nobody in the room was recognizing any of the cultural things that were going on, that were really suppressing voice. We have a bias towards oral, that most processes should take place with people talking to each other. This may touch a little bit on the online discussion actually that you were talking about in terms of cultures, because some online cultures will absolutely have an oral where we speak through, we'll definitely be talking, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them actually go to text, and often in online worlds, women in particular default to text-based models so that there isn't any gender attack. So it's not uncommon for a lot of those different environments for that to be a culture where people actually are much more text-based. But it can be all kinds of other people who might be text-based or might be visual or might be looking at other kinds of things, but we assume the process is going to be oral, we're going to chat. We make assumptions about who's there, what support looks like. As I said, I think in that one mediation, everybody in the room thought this person was supported because there was a lawyer there. Probably would have thought they were supported if her husband was there. I don't think that would have been support either, because he also would have been convinced that he wasn't allowed to speak up about cultural norms. So we have ideas about what support looks like. It might look very different than we think. And we also, again, while we have people who engage in different types of evaluative processes here, I don't think most of us think of the consensus-based decision-making as being something where evaluation by somebody who is seen as having authority in the room is actually really strongly supporting informed choice, except in certain very specific circumstances. I find that when you get the argument that evaluation does not impact self-determination in any way, and evaluative mediation is excellent, look at who says it. Mm-hmm. I have never heard that argument made, and it may just be the circles I travel in, by anyone who isn't in many ways a privileged participant in every dispute resolution process. Virtually always, somebody who is a lawyer or another professional is making the argument that it's good they need information in order to make a decision, so my evaluation helps them. Usually male, pretty much always white. I mean, and think about it, evaluation, it does support informed decision making if somebody has the privilege in the room to say no to the evaluation, to disagree. The more disempowered somebody is, the less able they are to actually self-determine in the face of an evaluator, of somebody, even in this consensus-based process where they are being given this choice. Their ability to move into a place of self-determination is really impacted. And I think you'll find that people coming from cultures where there's a lot of silencing, where there is a distrust of legal processes generally because there's a lot of corruption. All kinds of these sorts of things will lead to less and less true self-determination in the face of evaluative processes. So I think that there are assumptions, and I'm not saying everybody here makes those assumptions, but I think there's enough people in our community who do make the assumption that you're giving them the information in order for them to be able to make a decision. But giving information is different than evaluating to me. All right, I'm whipping through this because I want to get into some adaptations. I've done very few. Is there anything there that you don't know what it is? Because otherwise I'm going to assume everybody just knows there's lots of collaborative processes. And I'm going to hit only the ones that I think nobody knows. Structured negotiation is a term that Lainey Feingold uses for something she created for working with people specifically in the blind community. She has a book on it. It's in the resource thing. But it is around structuring negotiations where there's a lack of power for a community. It's a very American approach, but I think it has tons of applications in Canada in different kinds of ways. I would also say I'm going to hit avatars. And the reason I'm going to say that is because I want, I was talking about how we think about adaptations, to think about, sure, online, we can go into those text-based, and that sometimes is an advantage. We can go into audio, we can go into video. But there are other things we can do too that are tech-based. And one of them that is underutilized in mediation and law, I think, is the use of avatars in some form of room where they are acting for and stepping in for. So, I mean, I'm thinking like people do it in various online gaming environments, but you'll also see it in things like Second Life, or like there's a number of different things that have evolved from there. But of the different virtual worlds, having an avatar represent yourself in a virtual world. We don't think of it, but where they do think of it is counseling and education. And they have done tons of studies in both counseling and education around the impact of using an avatar. They have a really, really strong visceral connection. They feel real. Your engagement feels real. You lose face-to-face, but you don't lose the sense of viscerally engaging and physically moving through the environment. So you actually engage in a way that is actually quite profound, while at the same time there's a disconnect, so that you have an opportunity, because you're not actually that. A lot of people will find that they can engage in more difficult conversations through that particular environment, because there is that level of disconnect which is created. So they use it a lot with disabilities, because it is a way of evening playing field, right? You may not be able to participate in the same way sitting at the table when you're sitting in the wheelchair. You may not be able to sit there and engage in the same way. And so if you're not seeing each other, it takes away. It takes away from, we have massive social fat shaming, for instance. Some people feel better outside of that. It can remove gender, it can remove any kind of imbalances around race. So it can be a way to create a really different space for people who are experiencing power from things that we haven't necessarily thought through or found ways to do. People who, with social anxieties, it gets used for group therapy for folks with social anxieties a lot. And it's an opportunity to engage. So as I say, the literature isn't in our field, but the educational field and the therapy field, they're doing a lot of interesting exploration with this. And everything they write about is stuff that to me seems super applicable to ways to adapt processes for so many of these different kinds of things that come up. Go. You want to say something, but you have to come up.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've really decided on what I want to ask.
You don't have to. I'm not forcing you to say something.
No, but I think it ties a little bit back into Liz's point, especially in these places where the disconnect can help empower people to participate more fully. How do we? What indicators might we? Oh my God. Okay, what indicators might we be looking for to address whether that's going to empower or disinhibit the the uncivil activity that we're used to seeing in online or those sort of dissociated forums? I guess is I think what I'm asking for.
Yeah, and I think, and I mean I've only been in a few of these where it's been sort of like any kind of genuine negotiation, and they haven't been real mediations. But it's interesting that it doesn't look like Twitter trolls. Like, it's not that kind of disinhibited behavior that is happening here, because you still are that person. Everybody knows who you are in whatever environment it is. There might be some level of disconnect because the problem might have arisen in an online environment, so there might already be something like that. But generally, once you're actually speaking together in that engagement, it is a different feeling than the anonymity that comes up and tends to disinhibit. So I don't know that there's more than you're in a bit of a different kind of space, and you've got, ideally, probably some kind of neutral facilitating it, which changes the nature too. If you're just negotiating, maybe it's a little harder to get past that. So I think that I would, if I was concerned, knowing people had actually engaged in an online way in a really, really disrespectful way, that might not be the way to set it up without setting up different kinds of ground rules and without thinking through who's in the room. Is there a mediator? Is there somebody else? Are there support people? Who's actually there, or is it a one-on-one? Anyway, I think there's lots of things to think through on that, and I'm mostly throwing it out there, to be honest, because I think sometimes we don't spend a lot of time looking at possibilities outside our own field, but people are grappling with a lot of the same issues. So, okay, this is going to be super fast. Here's some process choices and just some discussion around it. And I do welcome you guys to talk about it a bit, because I realize I've just kind of I really have lectured at you. It wasn't the plan.
But we're going to remember to talk about.
We're going to remember to talk about process choices. We've talked a little bit about online environments, but we can talk more about it if we need to. We are going to talk about when we give things up, and we're going to just identify some of these things when people are. Because most of these, for Amanda, but also for others, most of the kinds of things that I'm talking about here are things that actually will take away from the likelihood, preventative, more than in the moment somebody's trying to give it away. They're more preventative. They're so that you don't hit that level of exhaustion, that you don't have people going, I can't take it anymore. So I think the first answer is you try to avoid it. You try to plan to make sure it doesn't happen. You look at things in designing the process around who's in the room, are we in person, timing, right? Like, what time of day are we doing it? What is going to support people to do it? the location, all of those kinds of things. And planning ahead. So available resources, I think that picks up things like the fidgets. It picks up safety concerns. It picks up what kinds of visual tools do you have? Have you got boards? Have you got, like, just, you want to think about all the things you can do. Memory aids, I've got flip charts there as memory aids too. A lot of people need something to track. One of the things that has come up a few times recently for me, and you get the patterns, right? Something happens and then you just notice it over and over. So one of the things that I've been noticing over and over is the number of people who are coming into different meetings and sessions with me who need to record because of one or another challenged memory. The first person came in and said, you know, they had a profound injury 20 years ago. The way they accommodate is they record so that they can go back, because otherwise they can't make eye contact, which takes away from their ability to engage. So, but it was a session that should have been private and confidential, but she needed to have a recording, and she needed to maintain a recording. And it was interesting because it was in a situation where there were actually rules around not taking notes that were kind of just presumed in this particular process, that people wouldn't take notes. But she couldn't effectively engage without recordings. So all of those are the planning ahead kinds of things. Usually if somebody has that sort of thing and it's a coping mechanism for them, they'll tell you, but it's why you have to have those pre-meeting discussions. And I guess like there's really no reason to not have a pre-meeting discussion with everybody. But a lot of the time we focus our pre-meeting discussions on what are the topics you need to talk about. You know, how are we going to raise them? Do you need to talk to anybody else? How do we create that setting? And we spend a little bit less time talking about things like self-care. Asking a question about self-care will bring up things about recordings if somebody has an issue. But it'll also bring up, I need to get up and stretch. I actually, you know, I hurt my hip. I can't stay seated for that long. A lot of you will know I had some weird invisible disabilities over the last few years, like just so weird. And it's funny because they don't come up in the discussion. And then all of a sudden you're in a room and somebody is trying to tell me that I have to sit at this seat because that's what they've decided was the right seating pattern. But they had never asked if I had anything that needed to be accommodated. And I do. My left elbow has to be on the end. I'm not sitting beside somebody tightly with my left elbow in there. So it's kind of interesting. It really messed up one of the meetings I went into where I had an assigned seat. And I was just going, I'm not sitting in my assigned seat. But what happens more often is that people are not as obnoxious as me going, I'm not sitting in my assigned seat. And they sit in their assigned seat, and then they spend the entire time distracted by keeping their elbows safe, right? It's the kind of thing that comes up if you talk self-care. What keeps you comfortable? What keeps you, do you have any kind of needs that we should be accommodating? It extends to things like, what food are we bringing in? The number of people who have dietary restrictions is really huge. The number of people who don't have dietary restrictions and therefore don't ask a question when they're setting up a meeting and don't recognize how exclusionary it feels if everybody else at the table has food, you know, that's also a fairly large number. Any of those kind of things. Who should be in there? Note-taking protocols. Mostly it's the flexibility stuff though, and for Amanda, if you haven't managed to set things up in such a way to prevent people from hitting that level of fade, whatever's causing it. It might be the exhaustion, sometimes it's the loss of attention, loss of focus, so many different things. Sometimes it's the depression, it's the stress. There are so many different things will trigger that sense of, I'm gonna get out, I need to get out of here. Sometimes it's physical discomfort too, right? And there are so many different things. But if you haven't managed to create that, a process that is allowing for that, then some of the things we might want to do are take breaks before decision making, like build them in anyway automatically. Don't just say, hey, are you there? It's really exciting when you're a mediator and somebody makes an offer and somebody else goes, yeah, okay. Like, it's a good feeling. But you can build into your process ways that there's an offer, but you've already said, we're going to put it on the table, then we're going to separate for a little bit of time. And we're going to think about it, right? I don't want a response right away. You got two businessmen who have given no indication whatsoever that they're dealing with any problems. They've got an ongoing relationship. You don't need to build it in, right? You know that they've had those conversations. You've been watching the conversations. But there's lots of circumstances in which you're just not sure that somebody isn't just going along with the process and saying yes to get out of there. So you normalize. You normalize breaks throughout, more frequent breaks. You normalize breaking before making decision making. Any of those kinds of things are really good ways to respond. And it's really quite possible if you know going in, because I wouldn't say you do this every time, but it's quite possible to normalize the concept that you won't reach a decision that day, because it isn't unusual for people to need time to think about things and process. Processing is varied. Yeah, I'm really bad at that because I am a super fast decision maker. And I am always waiting, like, okay, decision made. Why have you not agreed with me yet, Rowan? But it's, because I'm particularly extreme on the one side, maybe it's probably come up for me enough now that I recognize that's not necessarily the way everybody is. Lots of people want to let it percolate and need to feel like they've actually had a good decision. And sometimes we're afraid of that because we want to just like get that settlement, get it on paper. Yeah. So not being afraid of that is good. Did you want to say something, Carrie? Because you weren't well.
I'm about to cough again, sorry.
Oh, okay. All right, well, I'm at 6, which like is really bad because I've let nobody talk. But I will say, but I'm happy to chat afterwards. And I just don't want to kind of keep everybody in. Online audience is actually one of the things we can acknowledge is for the online audience, it is harder to stay engaged and focused. So that is something to take into account when you're doing online stuff. You have to think about engagement. Accommodating people with disabilities, there's a couple of the CoRe presentations. There's more of those online too if you want to look at them. You'll see the JI courses, and that entire page is stuff on trauma because I really do recommend you have a look at some of those materials. Some other resources, and then some stuff just on the processes. I threw those in at the end so that you could actually have a look at those. And Amanda, I'll just acknowledge that you're online, and I also cited you, so there you go. And now I'm going to cough. So, all right, so thank you all, and I'm happy to take some questions, but I'm going to pull the plug on this and say goodbye to the online audience. Though if you want to, you can shoot me notes, and I'm happy to chat afterwards too.